The morning of October 25, 1944, 6:37, 20 miles east of Samar Island, Lieutenant William Brooks, piloting a tubby TBF Avenger torpedo bomber on routine patrol from the escort carrier USS Saint Lo, keyed his radio transmitter and delivered a message that would define the last major naval battle of World War II. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 10 destroyers, steaming directly toward 16 lightly defended American escort carriers. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But this wasn't the nightmare Brooks described. The nightmare belonged to the Japanese officers commanding those warships, because in the span of 4 days, from October 23rd to October 26th, 1944, Japanese naval commanders would witness something that shattered every calculation, every assumption, every hope that had sustained them through 3 years of Pacific War. They would count American ships until the numbers lost meaning. They would watch aircraft darken skies in numbers their intelligence had declared impossible. They would see industrial capacity made manifest in steel and fire. And, in those moments, scattered across 4 separate engagements spanning over 100,000 square miles of ocean, Japanese officers would understand with crystalline clarity that the Pacific War was not merely lost, it had been lost before it began. This is the documented story of that realization. The moment when Japan's most experienced naval commanders looked upon American naval power at Leyte Gulf and understood they were fighting not a nation, but a continent. In June 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered catastrophic defeat at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost 3 fleet carriers, including the newest and most advanced warship in its navy, the Taiho. More devastating than the ships were the pilots. Japan lost over 600 aircraft and irreplaceable veteran aircrew in battles that lasted just 2 days. The carefully trained carrier pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had ranged across the Pacific in 1942 and 1943, were gone. Replacements trained in months rather than years climbed into cockpits, knowing they faced American pilots with combat experience, superior aircraft, and seemingly unlimited fuel and ammunition. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet from Tokyo, understood the mathematics of desperation. By October 1944, Japan possessed fewer capital ships than the Allied forces had total aircraft carriers in the Pacific. This disparity wasn't classified intelligence, it was observable reality to anyone who studied force dispositions. American submarine campaigns had so thoroughly strangled Japanese fuel supplies that the combined fleet split its forces. Heavy ships clustered near Singapore and Brunei, close to oil that could no longer reach Japan. Carriers remained in Japanese home waters, but with flight decks nearly empty of both aircraft and pilots. Yet the Philippines remained Japan's strategic lifeline. The archipelago controlled sea routes to Borneo and Sumatra, sources of rubber and petroleum vital for any hope of continuing the war. If Japan lost the Philippines, the empire would be severed in 2. Raw materials from the south could not reach factories in Japan and Manchuria. The war would strangle on its own logistics. Admiral Toyoda faced this calculation in October 1944, when American carrier strikes began hammering Formosa and the Ryukyu Islands. The target was clear: MacArthur and Nimitz, whose forces had advanced along 2 axes across the Pacific, were converging on the Philippines. On October 17th, American minesweepers and rangers approached small islands guarding Leyte Gulf. The invasion was beginning. Toyoda activated Operation Shoichi, Victory Plan No. 1. The plan committed nearly all remaining Japanese naval forces to a decisive battle. It was the kind of commitment that naval theorists had predicted would decide the Pacific War since 1941, but by October 1944, Japan's forces sailed to this decisive battle with a fundamental disadvantage that would become devastatingly clear in the waters around Leyte. They sailed to confront industrial capacity they could not match, and numbers they had not fully comprehended. The plan itself showed sophisticated tactical thinking constrained by desperate strategic reality. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would command the Northern Force, built around Japan's remaining aircraft carriers. But these carriers embarked just over 100 aircraft total, the equivalent of a single American fleet carrier's air group. Ozawa's mission was purely sacrificial: draw the American fast carrier task force away from Leyte Gulf long enough for Japan's heavy surface combatants to reach the invasion beaches. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would command the first striking force, designated the Center Force in American documents. This was Japan's main effort. 7 battleships, including Yamato and Musashi, the largest and most heavily armed battleships ever built. 11 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, supporting destroyers. This massive formation would transit the Sibuyan Sea, pass through San Bernardino Strait, and fall upon the American invasion fleet from the north. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would command a smaller southern force: 2 Fuso-class battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 4 destroyers. This force would approach through Surigao Strait from the south. Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima's second striking force, 3 cruisers and 7 destroyers, would support Nishimura's attack. On paper, a sophisticated pincer movement coordinated with carrier decoy operations. In execution, a plan that required perfect timing, reliable communications, air cover that didn't exist, and crucially, a fundamental misunderstanding of what they would face. October 20th, 1944. The American invasion commenced. Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid commanded 7th Fleet, more than 700 ships including transports, minesweepers, and amphibious vessels, facilitating the actual landings. 6 older battleships, veterans of Pearl Harbor, formed the Fire Support Squadron under Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf. 18 escort carriers provided close air support. These were the ships closest to Leyte's beaches, the vulnerable amphibious force that Japanese planning assumed would be the target. But supporting and covering this invasion fleet was Admiral William Bull, Halsey's 3rd Fleet. Task Force 38 constituted the bulk of American naval power in the Pacific. 8 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 6 fast battleships. The numerical disparity was stark. Halsey commanded more aircraft carriers than Japan had deployed in total. More than 1,600 aircraft could launch from American carriers. Against this, Japan's remaining carrier force embarked just over 100 aircraft with partially trained pilots. The American carrier force that steamed east of the Philippines represented industrial capacity on a scale that Japanese planners had intellectually understood but emotionally underestimated. Each Essex-class fleet carrier displaced 36,000 tons fully loaded. America commissioned 17 Essex-class carriers between 1942 and 1945. The shipyards that built them simultaneously produced dozens of smaller carriers, hundreds of destroyers, cruisers ranging from light to heavy, battleships both new and refurbished. American aircraft production told the same story. In 1944 alone, American factories produced over 96,000 military aircraft. Japanese production in 1944 reached 28,000 aircraft, but raw numbers understated the disparity. American aircraft incorporated better engines, superior manufacturing quality, reliable radios, effective armor protection. More critically, American replacement pilots arrived with 300 to 500 flight hours before entering combat. Japanese replacement pilots by late 1944 often had fewer than 100 flight hours total. Japanese naval officers understood these disparities intellectually. Intelligence reports documented American production capacity. But human psychology resists accepting impossible odds. Hope persists even against mathematics. Japanese planning assumed American forces would be stretched thin, vulnerable to concentrated attack, subject to the kind of decisive engagement that naval theorists had promised would determine the war. Reality would arrive in 4 distinct shocks across 4 days. October 23, 1944, 04:30 hours. The Palawan Passage. Vice Admiral Kurita's center force, the main Japanese striking force, transited narrow waters west of the Philippines. 5 columns of warships moving northeast toward the Sibuyan Sea. The formation put destroyers inside the battleship line, a configuration that sacrificed anti-submarine screening for formation compactness. Two American submarines, USS Data and USS Dace, had tracked the Japanese force since the previous evening. At dawn, from 1,000 yards range, Data launched 6 torpedoes at Kurita's flagship, the heavy cruiser Atago. 4 torpedoes struck. Atago sank in 19 minutes. Data's second salvo hit the heavy cruiser Takao, crippling her. USS Dace maneuvered and fired 4 torpedoes into the heavy cruiser Maya. Maya exploded and sank in under 4 minutes. Vice Admiral Kurita survived Atago's sinking. He transferred first to destroyer Kishinami, then to battleship Yamato. The center force had lost 3 heavy cruisers before even reaching the Philippine archipelago's interior seas. American codebreakers intercepted and decrypted damage reports. Halsey's Third Fleet knew Kurita's force was approaching. They knew his route, they knew his objective. October 24th, the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. Kurita's force, minus its lost cruisers, entered the Sibuyan Sea at dawn. American scout planes spotted the formation at 800 hours. By 10:30, radar operators aboard Yamato detected a large formation of incoming aircraft. The first wave consisted of aircraft from fleet carriers Intrepid and Cabot. Over the next 5 hours, 6 separate airstrikes would hammer Kurita's force, 259 total sorties. The attacks came in coordinated waves, dive bombers attacking from altitude, torpedo bombers skimming wave tops, fighters strafing deck crews. Battleship Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, and among the most powerful warships ever built, became the focus of concentrated attack. American pilots had never attacked a Japanese warship of this size. Many had never attacked any Japanese warship. Now they faced the largest single-surface formation the Imperial Japanese Navy had employed during the entire war. Musashi mounted 9 18.1-inch main guns, the largest naval rifles ever fitted to a warship. Her armor belt reached 16 inches thick. She was designed to survive concentrated battleship gunfire at close range, but she was not designed to survive 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits delivered across 5 hours of continuous air attack. By mid-afternoon, Musashi's bow was submerged. Her speed dropped to 6 knots. Watertight integrity failed as torpedo hits overwhelmed damage control capabilities. At 19:35, Musashi capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 crew members with her. Yamato took 2 bomb hits. Other ships in Kurita's force suffered varying degrees of damage. The fleet's speed, constrained by damaged vessels, dropped to 18 knots. Kurita faced a critical decision: continue towards San Bernardino, straight at reduced speed, certain to face more air attacks in the narrow passage, or temporarily reverse course out of American air range. At 15:30, Kurita ordered his fleet to reverse course westward. This was the first moment. Admiral Halsey, receiving reports from returning pilots describing Kurita's westward turn, concluded the center force was retreating. The threat from the west appeared neutralized when scout planes located Ozawa's Northern Force Carrier Group approaching from the northeast. Halsey made his decision. Third Fleet would pursue the Japanese carriers. The San Bernardino Strait, gateway through which Kurita's force would have to pass to reach Leyte, would be left unguarded. Halsey's decision responded to American naval doctrine, emphasizing offensive action and the primacy of aircraft carriers as strategic targets. But it also responded to a career-long desire to engage Japanese carriers. The opportunity to destroy Japan's remaining carrier force appeared to outweigh the risk that Kurita might reverse course again. At 17:15, Admiral Kurita did exactly that. After 90 minutes steaming west, center force reversed course again and headed back toward San Bernardino Strait. Through the night of October 24th to 25th, Kurita's battered force transited the strait unopposed. Meanwhile, to the south, Admiral Nishimura's southern force approached Surigao Strait. Unlike Kurita, Nishimura sailed directly into prepared defenses. Admiral Oldendorf, commanding 7th Fleet's bombardment group, had received warning of the southern approach. He deployed his 6 battleships across the northern end of Surigao Strait. Cruisers formed on the battleships' flanks, destroyers and PT boats positioned along the strait's length. This was the classic naval maneuver called crossing the T. Nishimura's ships would steam up the strait in column formation, able to bring only forward guns to bear. Oldendorf's battle line, positioned perpendicular to Nishimura's approach, could bring all main batteries to bear simultaneously. October 25th, 0200 hours. Nishimura's force entered Surigao Strait. PT boats attacked first with torpedoes, achieving no hits but reporting positions. Destroyer squadrons attacked next in coordinated runs from both flanks. Battleship Fuso took a torpedo hit, broke in half, and sank. Other ships suffered damage. The formation fragmented. At 0351, Oldendorf's battleships opened fire. West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Mississippi. 5 had been damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor and subsequently refloated and modernized. The 6th, Mississippi, was the oldest battleship in the American fleet, commissioned in 1917. These old battleships, relegated to shore bombardment and escort duties because faster vessels were needed for carrier operations, achieved what naval gunners called a textbook engagement. Radar fire control enabled accurate firing at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards in complete darkness. Battleship Yamashiro, Nishimura's flagship, took concentrated fire from multiple American battleships. She capsized and sank at 0419. Admiral Nishimura died with his ship. Heavy cruiser Mogami, damaged by gunfire and unable to maneuver, would be scuttled later that morning. 3 of 4 destroyers were sunk. Admiral Shima's supporting force, arriving after Nishimura's destruction, encountered the carnage, achieved nothing, and withdrew. The Battle of Surigao Strait represented the last time battleships would engage battleships in naval combat. It ended in comprehensive American victory achieved in under 4 hours. To the north, off Cape Engano, Ozawa's sacrificial carrier force finally attracted American attention. Halsey's Third Fleet, pursuing what appeared to be a major Japanese carrier concentration, launched massive airstrikes beginning at dawn on October 25th. Ozawa's 4 carriers embarked just 108 aircraft total among them. They could mount minimal defensive combat air patrol. American strikes found virtually undefended targets. Through the morning, American aircraft sank all 4 Japanese carriers. Fleet carrier Zuikaku, last survivor of the Pearl Harbor strike force. Light carriers Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho. The Northern Force succeeded in its mission. It drew Halsey's overwhelming strength away from Leyte. But the cost was the complete destruction of Japan's carrier capability. This left 1 Japanese force still operational and approaching its target. Vice Admiral Kurita's center force, having transited San Bernardino Strait during the night, emerged east of Samar at dawn on October 25th. Directly ahead lay 3 task units of escort carriers, the most vulnerable major warships in the American fleet. This was Lieutenant Brooks's nightmare sighting at 6:37 that morning. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commanded Task Unit 77.4.3. Radio call sign Taffy 3. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. His mission was providing close air support for troops ashore on Leyte and conducting anti-submarine patrols. The escort carriers under his command were Casablanca-class vessels, mass-produced to defend convoys from aircraft and submarines. They displaced 7,800 tons. Their maximum speed was 19 knots. Each carried 28 aircraft. They were designed to escort merchant convoys across the Atlantic, not to fight battleships. At 6:37, when Lieutenant Brooks transmitted his contact report, Sprague faced a tactical impossibility. 4 Japanese battleships, including Yamato, displacing 72,000 tons and mounting 9 18-inch guns, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. This was the most powerful surface action group the Imperial Japanese Navy had deployed since Midway, and it was 20 miles away, steaming at 20 knots directly toward Taffy 3's position. The disparity wasn't merely numerical, it was categorical. Yamato's main guns could engage targets at ranges exceeding 26 miles. The escort carrier's 5-inch deck guns had effective ranges under 10 miles. Yamato's armor belt, over 16 inches thick, could withstand hits from 14-inch battleship guns. The escort carriers had no armor belt. They were essentially cargo ships fitted with flight decks. At 6:59, Yamato opened fire from a range of 19.5 miles. The first salvo straddled the escort carrier White Plains. The massive shells, each weighing 3,300 pounds. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Created geysers of water that buckled White Plains hull plating and tripped circuit breakers throughout the ship. Japanese battleships loaded shells with colored dye to assist in ranging. Green, pink, and red waterspouts erupted among the American carriers as multiple Japanese ships found the range. Sprague ordered his carriers to turn east, away from the Japanese fleet, and make maximum speed, 19 knots against an enemy making 24 knots. The mathematics were brutal. Kurita's force would close the range by 5 knots per hour. In under 3 hours, Japanese battleships would be alongside the escort carriers, firing at point-blank range into unarmored hulls. Sprague ordered his 3 destroyers to attack: USS Johnston, Howell, and Heermann. Commander Ernest Evans aboard Johnston didn't wait for detailed orders. At 7:00, Johnston turned toward the Japanese fleet and increased to flank speed. 1 destroyer, displacing 2,100 tons, charging 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers. Johnston closed to 10,000 yards and launched 10 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano, leading the Japanese formation. 1 torpedo hit, blowing off Kumano's bow. The cruiser fell out of formation. Johnston then engaged Japanese battleship Kongo, with her 5-inch guns at a range of 7,000 yards. The destroyer's guns could not penetrate Kongo's armor, but they could damage topside equipment, force damage control parties into action, and crucially, draw Japanese attention away from the carriers. Japanese heavy cruisers concentrated fire on Johnston. At 7:10, 3 14-inch shells from Kongo struck Johnston's bridge and engine room. Commander Evans was severely wounded. Johnston lost steering control, power to 3 of 5 gun mounts, and half her speed. But Evans kept fighting. Using hand signals because internal communications were destroyed, he directed his remaining guns against Japanese cruisers. Destroyers, Howell and Heermann, followed Johnston into attack. At 7:20, Howell launched torpedoes at battleship Kongo from 9,000 yards. Several torpedoes hit, forcing Kongo to turn away. Heermann pressed attacks against heavy cruisers, closing to 4,400 yards before launching torpedoes. At that range, Japanese cruiser secondary batteries could engage effectively. Shells walked toward Heermann, straddling repeatedly. 1 hit destroyed the destroyer's forward gun mount. The 4 destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 joined the attack. These smaller vessels, designated for anti-submarine warfare, displaced 1,370 tons and mounted 2 5-inch guns. USS Samuel B. Roberts closed to within 5,300 yards of Japanese heavy cruisers and engaged with main guns. For 35 minutes, Roberts traded fire, with cruisers displacing 15,000 tons. The destroyer escort hit heavy cruiser Chikuma multiple times before Japanese fire found Roberts. 14-inch shells tore through the unarmored hull. Roberts lost power, flooding, capsized and sank. But the American destroyer and destroyer escort attacks achieved something beyond the immediate damage they inflicted. They forced Vice Admiral Kurita to maneuver defensively. His formation fragmented as individual ships turned to evade torpedo spreads. The cohesive battle line that had emerged from San Bernardino Strait dissolved into individual ship actions. Japanese heavy cruisers, pursuing different targets at different speeds, lost visual contact with each other in the rain squalls that intermittently swept across the battle area. Aboard Yamato, now serving as Kurita's flagship after Otago's sinking 2 days earlier, the admiral faced incomplete information. Radio communications between Japanese ships were unreliable. Kurita had no air reconnaissance. He didn't know that Halsey's Third Fleet was far to the north, engaging Ozawa's carriers. He didn't know that the escort carriers before him represented the only American ships between his force and the vulnerable transport fleet in Leyte Gulf. What Kurita did know was that American destroyers were launching coordinated torpedo attacks with a ferocity that suggested major American surface combatants were nearby. He knew that aircraft from the escort carriers, despite their small numbers, were attacking continuously. He knew that his formation was fragmenting under pressure from forces that, by weight of fire, should have been annihilated within minutes, but continued fighting with desperate intensity. The escort carrier aircraft added to Kurita's uncertainty. Taffy 3's carriers launched every available aircraft, fighters armed with machine guns only, because the carriers hadn't loaded anti-ship ordnance for an anti-submarine patrol mission, torpedo bombers without torpedoes, dive bombers without armor-piercing bombs. The aircrews attacked anyway, making dry runs without releasing weapons simply to force Japanese ships to maneuver. When fighters expended ammunition, they continued strafing runs without firing, forcing Japanese gunners to engage phantom threats. Aircraft from other escort carrier groups joined the attack. Taffy 1 and Taffy 2, positioned south of Taffy 3, launched strikes. These aircraft carried proper anti-ship weapons. Torpedoes struck heavy cruiser Suzuya, which exploded and sank. Bombs hit cruiser Chikuma, setting fires that would eventually force her abandonment. The cumulative effect of continuous air attack, however light individual strikes might be, degraded Japanese effectiveness and reinforced Kurita's perception that he faced a larger American force than actually existed. At 7:50, USS Johnston sank. Commander Evans went down with his ship. At 8:40, USS Howell capsized and sank. Destroyer Heermann survived, heavily damaged. The destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts and Dennis had been sunk, but their sacrificial attacks bought time for the escort carriers to run. Then, at 9:11, one of the most controversial decisions of the Pacific War occurred. Vice Admiral Kurita ordered his ships to break off the action and turn north. The reasons for Kurita's decision have been debated for 8 decades. His official report cited concerns about additional American forces approaching from the northeast. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi, later wrote that battle fatigue, poor communications, and complete lack of air reconnaissance influenced Japanese decisions. Kurita himself, in interviews with American officers after the war, remained defensive and evasive about the decision. But in 1977, 3 days before his death, Kurita told former students from the Naval Academy what he had been thinking. He had seen American aircraft attacking in numbers his intelligence had told him were impossible so far from American fleet carriers. He had seen destroyers charge battleships in coordinated attacks that suggested fleet-level tactical training. He had intercepted radio transmissions, in English he couldn't understand, that suggested multiple American task forces coordinating actions. He had lost cruisers to air attack and torpedo attack, and had no air reconnaissance to tell him what lay beyond his visual horizon. And he had spent 4 days under continuous attack from American air power that appeared unlimited. Kurita calculated that even if he reached Leyte Gulf, even if he destroyed the transports there, the return journey through waters dominated by American air power would annihilate his force. The decisive engagement that Japanese planning had promised would tip the war's balance looked instead like a one-way suicide mission against an enemy whose strength exceeded every estimate. As Koyanagi later acknowledged, by October 1944, the Japanese fleet no longer had strength enough to carry on a decisive engagement, sending a great mass of surface craft, without air cover, nearly 1,000 miles exposed to enemy submarines and air forces, with a mission of breaking into a hostile anchorage, was completely desperate, reckless, and unprecedented. A suicide order. But there was something deeper in Kurita's decision. Something that emerged not from tactical calculation, but from cumulative realization. For 4 days, from October 23rd to October 26th, Japanese naval commanders had faced American power that exceeded not just their estimates, but their conceptual framework for understanding the war. Matsuyoshi Tsuchiya, a petty officer aboard cruiser Atago when she sank, later recalled watching the submarine attack unfold. We didn't expect submarines so far from their bases. The Americans were everywhere. After transferring to Yamato, Tsuchiya witnessed the air attacks on October 24th. The waves kept coming. We would drive off one attack, and another formation would appear. I had served in the Solomons. I had seen American air attacks before, but not like this. Not so many aircraft. Not for so many hours without pause. Toshio Yoshi served aboard battleship Yamato throughout the battle. He was in charge of ammunition for machine guns near Yamato's forward main turret. On October 24th, during the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, Yoshi recalled aircraft attacking from all directions simultaneously. The sky was full of them. Our anti-aircraft guns fired continuously until barrels overheated. We shot down many aircraft, but more kept coming. I remember thinking, where are all these planes coming from? How many carriers do the Americans have? The next day, off Samar, Yoshi watched Yamato's main guns engage the American escort carriers. We hit them. I saw the shells land, but they kept operating. They kept launching aircraft. And the destroyers. The American destroyers attacked like they outnumbered us. They charged directly at battleships. I couldn't understand it. They must have known they would be destroyed. This incomprehension, repeated in interviews with surviving Japanese veterans, reveals the psychological dimension of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Japanese naval officers understood intellectually that America possessed superior industrial capacity. Intelligence reports had documented American ship construction rates, but intellectual understanding differs profoundly from visceral realization. At Leyte Gulf, Japanese commanders experienced that realization in compressed, traumatic time. They encountered American submarines operating aggressively in waters Japan considered secure. They faced air attacks of an intensity and duration that their training had told them carriers could not sustain. They engaged surface combatants that fought with tactical coordination and individual ferocity that suggested confidence born of overwhelming strength. The numbers tell part of the story. The Battle of Leyte Gulf engaged 282 ships, nearly 200,000 personnel, across more than 100,000 square miles of ocean. Japan deployed 1 fleet carrier, 3 light carriers, 9 battleships, 19 cruisers, and 34 destroyers. America deployed 8 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 18 escort carriers, 12 battleships, 24 cruisers, and 141 destroyers. The disparity in carriers was 3-1. The disparity in total ships was 216 American and Australian ships to 64 Japanese ships. But numbers alone don't capture what Japanese officers experienced. They experienced industrial capacity made manifest. Every ship they sank, every aircraft they shot down, seemed to be immediately replaced. The Americans fought with a profligacy that suggested inexhaustible reserves. Destroyers charged battleships because America built destroyers faster than Japan could sink them. Aircraft attacked in continuous waves because American carriers launched replacement aircraft before recovering the first strike. Submarines operated aggressively because America commissioned submarines faster than Japan could hunt them. Admiral Koyanagi's post-war account captured this realization. We anticipated no difficulty in making contact with the enemy task force, because we estimated that the enemy with all his power was already pursuing Kurita's force. We were wrong. The Americans had enough ships to pursue Ozawa to the north, to defend Surigao Strait to the south, to cover Leyte Gulf with carriers, and still have destroyers to attack our main force. We had divided their fleet in our planning, but they had so many ships that dividing their fleet still left them superior in every engagement. The battle off Samar lasted 2.5 hours. In that time, Kurita's center force sank 2 escort carriers, USS Gambier Bay and USS Saint Lo. The latter fell not to gunfire but to the first organized kamikaze attack of the war. Japan sank 3 destroyers and 1 destroyer escort. Japan lost 3 heavy cruisers sunk, 3 heavy cruisers damaged severely enough to withdraw from action. But the material exchange ratio understated the strategic consequence. Kurita withdrew. Invasion fleet at Leyte remained intact. Japan had committed nearly its entire remaining operational naval strength to a decisive engagement. That engagement ended with Japanese forces withdrawing before accomplishing their objective. And crucially, it ended with Japanese naval commanders understanding that no decisive engagement would alter the war's trajectory. The realization was cumulative. It built across 4 days of continuous combat. On October 23, submarine attacks demonstrated American undersea capability. Japanese officers understood that America's submarine campaign had already crippled Japan's merchant fleet. Over 60% of Japanese merchant tonnage sunk during the war fell to American submarines. But submarines were supposed to target merchants, not conduct aggressive attacks on major warships in defended waters. The Palawan Passage attack demonstrated that American submarines operated with a confidence and aggressiveness that suggested they considered Japanese-controlled waters permeable. On October 24, air attacks on Kurita's force demonstrated American aviation capacity. 6 separate strikes, 259 sorties. The sinking of Musashi required 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes. That this much ordnance could be delivered against a maneuvering target in 5 hours of attacks demonstrated coordination, training, and sheer aircraft numbers that exceeded Japanese capability by orders of magnitude. Japanese carriers at the battle's start could barely launch 100 aircraft total among 4 carriers. American carriers launched over 250 aircraft in a single day against 1 target, and this represented only a portion of their available strength. On October 25 at Surigao Strait, Nishimura's force encountered the American battleship line. The engagement demonstrated American radar fire control technology. Japanese ships equipped with optical rangefinders could engage targets. They could see. American ships equipped with radar could engage targets in complete darkness at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards, with an accuracy that Japanese gunnery officers found difficult to credit. The one-sided nature of Surigao Strait wasn't merely a matter of numbers or tactics, it was a technological demonstration. America had integrated radar into fire control systems with a sophistication Japan hadn't matched. On October 25 off Cape Engano, Ozawa's sacrifice achieved its tactical objective. It drew Halsey north. But it ended with the complete destruction of Japan's carrier capability. 4 carriers sunk. The fleet carrier Zuikaku, which had participated in every major carrier engagement from Pearl Harbor to the Philippine Sea, went down with most of her crew. Japan's naval aviation ended not gradually, but absolutely. After Leyte Gulf, Japan possessed no operational carrier capability. The arm that had dominated the Pacific in 1942 ceased to exist. On October 25 off Samar, Kurita's center force faced the cumulative weight of American defensive capability. The escort carriers, the most vulnerable major warships in the American fleet, survived because America had enough destroyers to sacrifice in their defense. The destroyer and destroyer escort attacks off Samar represented tactics of desperation, but they were tactics America could afford. Losing 3 destroyers and 2 destroyer escorts, ships that represented months of construction and hundreds of trained crew, was acceptable because America built destroyers and trained crews faster than Japan could sink them. This was the realization that broke Japanese naval strategy. Not a single devastating defeat, not a decisive engagement lost, but the accumulation of evidence across 4 days that Japan fought an enemy whose material resources exceeded the framework within which Japanese planning had operated. Japanese pre-war planning had assumed a naval war of courtiers, attrition in which America's numerical superiority would be degraded by Japanese tactical excellence, superior night fighting capability, better torpedoes, and warriors fighting with spirit America's materially comfortable society could not match. By October 1944, every one of these assumptions had proven false. American naval aviation exceeded Japanese capability. American radar granted night fighting superiority. American destroyers charged battleships, and American industrial capacity meant that losing individual battles inflicted unsustainable attrition not on America but on Japan. Vice Admiral Kurita, when asked decades after the war why he withdrew off Samar, gave an answer that historians have debated endlessly. He said he was looking for American fleet carriers. He believed the escort carriers before him were bait, that American fleet carriers lay beyond his visual horizon ready to annihilate his force. This belief was factually incorrect. Halsey's carriers were far to the north, but Kurita's belief revealed something more significant than a tactical mistake. It revealed that Japanese commanders no longer trusted their intelligence, their reconnaissance, or their understanding of American dispositions. They had been surprised too many times. They had encountered American strength in places intelligence said no strength existed. The psychological foundation of Japanese naval confidence had eroded. By October 26, 1944, when the last stragglers from Kurita's center force cleared Philippine waters, the Battle of Leyte Gulf had decided more than control of the Philippines. It had destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy as an offensive force. The statistics documented the material destruction. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and 1 submarine. Over 10,500 Japanese sailors and aviators died. Japan lost more than 500 aircraft, including land-based planes that sortied against American forces. American losses, while significant in individual human terms, were strategically negligible. 1 light carrier, USS Princeton, 2 escort carriers, Gambier Bay and Saint Lo, 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, over 200 aircraft, approximately 2,800 Americans killed, another 1,000 wounded. But for every American ship lost, American shipyards would deliver 3 replacements within months. For every American aircraft shot down, factories would produce 10 more. For every trained pilot lost, training commands would graduate 20 replacements. Japan possessed no such capacity. The ships lost at Leyte Gulf represented nearly all of Japan's remaining operational combat power. The pilots and air crews lost could not be replaced within the war's remaining timeframe. Most critically, the psychological foundation supporting continued resistance had fractured. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy effectively ceased offensive operations. The remaining capital ships, battleships Yamato, Nagato, Haruna, Kongo, Ise, and Hyuga, along with surviving cruisers and destroyers, returned to Japanese waters. There they remained, largely inactive, for lack of fuel oil. American submarines had so thoroughly interdicted tanker traffic from the Dutch East Indies that Japan's fuel reserves approached exhaustion. The few major operations conducted by remaining Japanese surface forces were explicitly suicidal. Operation 10 Go in April 1945 sent Yamato on a one-way mission to Okinawa, with fuel for only a single direction. American carrier aircraft sank Yamato long before she reached Okinawa. Over 3,000 crew members died. The strategic implications extended beyond naval combat. With the Imperial Japanese Navy broken, American forces could operate throughout Philippine waters with minimal interference. MacArthur's forces completed the liberation of Leyte by December 1944. The campaign then expanded to Luzon, where Manila fell in February 1945. American possession of the Philippines severed Japan's strategic connection to resources in Southeast Asia. The rubber and petroleum that had motivated Japan's southern expansion became inaccessible. Japan's war economy, already strained by years of combat and submarine interdiction, began its final collapse. Air operations told the same story. With carrier aviation destroyed and land-based aviation depleted, Japan turned to kamikaze tactics. The first organized kamikaze attacks occurred during the closing phases of Leyte Gulf, when Special Attack Corps pilots deliberately crashed bomb-laden aircraft into American ships. On October 25th, a kamikaze struck escort carrier Saint Lo, which exploded and sank. This tactic, born of desperation, would intensify through the war's final months. At Okinawa in April 1945, nearly 2,000 Japanese aircraft sortied on kamikaze missions. The tactic inflicted damage and caused casualties, but it also represented the ultimate admission that Japan could no longer contest American air superiority through conventional means. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan's home islands accelerated after Leyte Gulf. With the Imperial Japanese Navy unable to interfere, American forces seized islands closer to Japan. Iwo Jima fell in March 1945. Okinawa fell in June 1945. These islands provided bases for B-29 bombers conducting systematic destruction of Japanese cities. The firebombing of Tokyo, on March 9 to 10, 1945, killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night. By August 1945, American bombers operated over Japan with near impunity. Japanese fighter defenses, hobbled by fuel shortages and pilot attrition, could mount only sporadic resistance. For Japanese naval officers who survived Leyte Gulf, the Committee of IFAR's battle represented a before and after moment in their understanding of the war. Many spent the war's final months at naval bases, watching ships remain pierside for lack of fuel. Some transferred to shore commands or to training duties. A few participated in the desperate final operations that sent remaining ships on suicide missions. The psychological impact on these officers was profound and lasting. Matsuyoshi Tsuchiya, who survived Otago's sinking and served aboard Yamato through Leyte Gulf, later recalled, "After Leyte, we knew. We didn't speak about it openly, but every officer and sailor knew the war was finished. We continued fighting because those were our orders. But the belief we could win, the confidence that Japanese spirit would overcome American material strength, that died at Leyte." Toshio Yoshi, who served aboard Yamato throughout the battle, reflected decades later on the moment of realization. "I was young. I was 19. I believed what we were told about American weakness and Japanese superiority. At Leyte, I watched our largest battleship fire at American carriers and they survived. I watched American aircraft attack for hours without stopping. I watched our ships sink and understood that for every ship we lost, the Americans had 10 more. That was when I understood we had lost the war before it started. We just didn't know it yet." The officer corps faced similar reckoning. Vice Admiral Kurita spent the war's remaining months at shore commands. He became commandant of the Naval Academy at Etajima, where, unlike some predecessors, he avoided teaching officer candidates to sacrifice themselves for the emperor. Instead, especially during the war's final months, he focused on skills that would aid young men in Japan's reconstruction. This represented a profound shift for a senior naval officer. Rather than preparing students for glorious death in battle, Kurita prepared them for survival and rebuilding. The decision suggested his private understanding that the war was lost and Japan's future lay in recovering from defeat rather than fighting to extinction. After the war, American interrogators questioned Kurita about his decisions at Leyte Gulf. Commander Thomas Mura, who conducted the interrogation, noted Kurita as somewhat on the defensive, giving only the briefest of replies. Kurita withheld extensive information during these official interrogations, but in December 1977, 3 days before his death, Kurita spoke more openly to former students from the Naval Academy. He revealed that his decision to search for American fleet carriers off Samar rather than pressing the attack on transports in Leyte Gulf stemmed from his assessment of the naval war's broader situation. What had we come this far for? Bringing so many ships, and also losing so many ships, wasn't it in order to win a victory at Leyte? But Kurita understood that sinking transports, while tactically satisfying, would not alter strategic reality. With 20,000 to 30,000 lives under his command, he was unwilling to engage his fleet, with minimal air support, against what he believed was an overwhelming American carrier force sailing back south to intercept. The decision to withdraw wasn't cowardice. It was recognition that the decisive engagement Japanese planning had promised would tip the war's balance had instead revealed the war was already decided. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the sacrificial Northern Force, survived the sinking of his flagship carrier Zuikaku. American destroyers rescued him from the water. During post-war interrogations, Ozawa admitted he did not have much confidence in being a lure, but there was no other way than to try. This fatalism pervaded Japanese senior leadership by October 1944. They understood the mission was likely futile. They executed it because Japanese military culture demanded continued resistance regardless of odds. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura died when battleship Yamashiro capsized and sank in Surigao Strait. He went down with his ship adhering to the naval tradition that captains share their ship's fate. But Nishimura's death, and the deaths of thousands of sailors in Surigao Strait, accomplished nothing strategically. The southern force was annihilated before it could threaten the landing force. The sacrifice purchased no time, sank no enemy ships, advanced no strategic objective. It simply demonstrated that Japanese forces, however bravely fought, could not overcome American material superiority and tactical excellence. The broader Japanese military establishment faced similar reckoning after Leyte Gulf. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo received reports of the battle's outcome with what contemporary accounts described as stunned silence. The Operation Show plan had represented Japan's last attempt at a fleet-scale offensive that might alter the war's trajectory. Its comprehensive failure meant no further fleet operations could be contemplated. Japan's strategy devolved to simple attrition, inflicting casualties on American forces in hope that American public opinion would demand a negotiated settlement rather than invasion of the home islands. This strategy failed to account for the same material disparity that had doomed the fleet at Leyte Gulf. America could sustain casualties that Japan could not inflict at rates necessary to alter American strategic planning. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated this reality. American forces accepted 7,000 dead at Iwo Jima and over 12,000 dead at Okinawa because military leadership judged these casualties acceptable costs for seizing bases necessary for invading Japan. Japanese forces lost virtually their entire garrisons at both locations, over 20,000 dead at Iwo Jima and over 100,000 dead at Okinawa, without altering American operational planning. The kamikaze campaign represented the ultimate expression of this strategic bankruptcy. At Okinawa, Japanese forces launched nearly 2,000 suicide aircraft sorties between April and June 1945. These attacks sank or damaged over 400 American vessels, killing nearly 5,000 American sailors. But America possessed the industrial capacity and trained manpower to absorb these losses and continue operations. Japan did not possess capacity to sustain kamikaze operations indefinitely. The pilots, aircraft, and fuel expended on suicide missions represented Japan's last reserves. When those reserves exhausted, Japan would possess no means of resistance except ground forces, armed with rifles against an enemy possessing complete air and naval superiority. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, ended debate about Japan's capacity for continued resistance, but senior Japanese naval officers later acknowledged privately that the decision to surrender, announced by Emperor Hirohito on August 15, recognized reality that had been apparent since Leyte Gulf. Japan could not win. Japan could not force a negotiated settlement. Japan could only prolong the war at increasing cost in Japanese lives, while American forces systematically destroyed Japanese cities and prepared for invasion. Vice Admiral Kurita, when asked by post-war interviewers what caused the Imperial Japanese Navy's eventual downfall, replied simply, "We ran out of oil." This answer, while factually accurate, understated the broader failure. Japan didn't merely run out of oil. Japan encountered an enemy whose industrial capacity exceeded Japanese ability to degrade through military action. American production of ships, aircraft, fuel, ammunition, and trained personnel operated at scales that rendered Japanese attrition strategies futile. The numbers document this disparity with brutal clarity. In 1944, American shipyards commissioned 8 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 light carriers, 51 escort carriers, 2 Iowa-class battleships, 6 battleships total, numerous cruisers, and over 400 destroyers and destroyer escorts. In the same year, Japan commissioned 0 fleet carriers, 1 unfinished light carrier that never became operational, no battleships, and a handful of smaller vessels. American factories produced 96,000 military aircraft in 1944. Japanese factories produced 28,000. American pilot training graduated 50,000 pilots in 1944. Japanese training produced fewer than 10,000, many with inadequate flight hours. This disparity meant that every major engagement, regardless of tactical outcome, favored America strategically. Japan could win individual battles but still lose the attrition war because American forces replaced losses faster than Japan could inflict them. At Leyte Gulf, this reality became undeniable. Japanese forces witnessed American strength that exceeded every estimate, that appeared inexhaustible, that demonstrated industrial capacity on a continental scale. The Battle of Leyte Gulf's legacy extends beyond the immediate strategic consequences. It represents the moment when material capacity definitively trumped tactical excellence, fighting spirit, and strategic creativity. Japanese pre-war planning had assumed that American society, comfortable and democratic, would lack the will to sustain long war against a determined enemy. This assumption proved comprehensively false. American society sustained production levels and casualty rates necessary to achieve total victory. American military personnel fought with tactical skill, unit cohesion, and individual courage that Japanese planners had assumed only Japanese forces possessed. The destroyer attacks off Samar exemplified this reality. Commander Ernest Evans, commanding USS Johnston, received the Medal of Honor posthumously for his actions. The citation noted his decision to charge a Japanese fleet of overwhelming strength without hesitation, his continued fighting after his ship sustained catastrophic damage, and his sacrifice of his ship and his life to protect the carriers under his charge. This was precisely the kind of warrior spirit Japanese military culture celebrated. But American military culture produced it at scale across an entire navy, across thousands of ships, among hundreds of thousands of personnel. Japanese survivors of Leyte Gulf carried their experiences into post-war life. Those who immigrated to America, and thousands eventually did, often reflected on the irony of their wartime experiences. They had fought against American power that seemed infinite. After the war, they experienced American prosperity that confirmed wartime impressions. American society that could produce hundreds of warships while fighting a two-front global war was a society whose industrial and organizational capacity exceeded anything they had witnessed in Japan. The professional relationships that developed in some cases between former enemies reflected shared recognition of what Leyte Gulf had demonstrated. American and Japanese naval officers who met decades after the war often found common ground in discussions of the battle's tactical details. But underlying these professional conversations was mutual understanding that the war's outcome had been determined not by courage or tactics, but by industrial capacity that Japan could not match. Annual reunions of Leyte Gulf veterans, both American and Japanese, became venues for this mutual recognition. Former enemies who had tried to kill each other in October 1944 met as old men to compare memories, correct historical records, and acknowledge the courage shown by both sides. These reunions rarely featured triumphalism from American participants or bitterness from Japanese participants. Instead, they featured shared acknowledgement of the battle's scale, its cost in lives on both sides, and its definitive demonstration of how industrial capacity determines modern war outcomes. Historical assessment of Leyte Gulf has generated extensive debate about command decisions, particularly Admiral Halsey's choice to pursue Ozawa's carriers rather than guard San Bernardino Strait. Historians continue arguing about whether Halsey's decision was justified, whether better coordination between 3rd and 7th Fleets would have resulted in complete destruction of Kurita's force, whether Kurita should have pressed his attack off Samar. These tactical debates obscure the strategic reality that Leyte Gulf made evident. By October 1944, Japan had lost the naval war regardless of Leyte Gulf's specific outcome. Even if Kurita had reached Leyte Gulf and sunk every transport there, American forces would have landed again weeks later with replacement ships and troops. Even if Halsey had stayed to guard San Bernardino Strait and completely destroyed Kurita's force, Japan's strategic situation would have remained hopeless. The decisive engagement that Japanese planning had sought since 1941 occurred at Leyte Gulf, but the engagement decided nothing that material realities hadn't already determined. The Battle of Leyte Gulf demonstrated that modern industrial war is fundamentally a contest of production capacity, not just military prowess. Nations that can replace losses faster than enemies can inflict them possess an effectively insurmountable advantage. Japan, for all its tactical excellence, for all the courage of individual sailors and pilots, for all the sophistication of its ships and aircraft, could not overcome the fundamental disparity in industrial capacity. This lesson influenced post-war military planning in multiple nations. The realization that industrial capacity determines modern war outcomes shaped Cold War strategies, emphasizing industrial mobilization, production surge capacity, and economic strength as military fundamentals. The lesson that tactical excellence cannot overcome strategic material disadvantage informed military education at service academies worldwide. For the men who fought at Leyte Gulf, particularly Japanese survivors, the battle represented their generation's defining experience. They had witnessed the moment when their nation's military power broke against an enemy whose resources exceeded comprehension. They had seen the most powerful battleships ever built fail to achieve their objectives because the enemy possessed more ships, more aircraft, more of everything. They had fought with desperate courage and watched that courage prove insufficient against enemy possessing both equal courage and overwhelming material advantage. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and eventually became one of the world's leading industrial economies, some veterans reflected on the irony. The industrial capacity Japan developed post-war, partnered with American economic assistance, was the kind of capacity Japan had needed in 1941 to fight the war it had chosen. By developing that capacity in peace rather than war, Japan achieved prosperity that wartime victories could never have secured. The ships that fought at Leyte Gulf are gone now. Yamato rests on the ocean floor south of Kyushu, sunk during Operation Tengo. Musashi lies in the Sibuyan Sea where American aircraft sent her. The American ships, most scrapped in the post-war drawdown, survive only in museums. USS Johnston, found in 2019 by deep-sea explorers, lies at a depth of over 21,000 feet, the deepest shipwreck ever located. Her hull still bears battle damage from the action off Samar, but the battle's legacy persists in strategic understanding of modern war. Industrial capacity matters, production capacity matters. The ability to replace losses matters more than the ability to inflict losses. Tactical excellence, however necessary, cannot overcome strategic material disadvantage. These lessons, purchased at cost of thousands of lives and hundreds of ships, remain relevant for any nation contemplating military conflict against an adversary with superior industrial resources. The Japanese officers who counted American ships at Leyte Gulf until the numbers lost meaning understood this reality viscerally. They watched the sky fill with American aircraft and understood they faced not a fleet but a production system. They engaged American destroyers, charging battleships, and understood they faced not individual ships, but an organizational culture that produced courage at scale. They witnessed 4 days of combat that demonstrated conclusively that the Pacific War had been lost before it began, because Japan had chosen war against an enemy whose industrial capacity exceeded Japan's ability to degrade through military action. This was the truth that broke the Imperial Japanese Navy at Leyte Gulf, not a single devastating battle, not a decisive engagement lost through tactical error, but the accumulated realization across 4 days that they fought an enemy whose resources were, for all practical purposes, infinite. An enemy who could lose ships and aircraft and continue operations without apparent degradation. An enemy who fought with both tactical excellence and material abundance. The 100 warships Japanese officers witnessed gathering in Philippine waters in October 1944 represented not just American naval strength, but American industrial power made manifest in steel. And in witnessing that manifestation, in counting those ships, in fighting against that power, and watching it absorb everything Japan could inflict and continue operating, Japanese naval commanders understood with finality that the Pacific was lost, not because they lacked courage, not because their tactics failed, but because they had chosen war against a continent that could produce warships faster than Japan could sink them. That realization, painful and absolute, ended the Imperial Japanese Navy's offensive capability. The fleet remained, ships still floated, crews still manned them, but the belief that concentration of force and tactical excellence could overcome American material superiority died at Leyte Gulf, and with that belief died any remaining hope that Japan could achieve military objectives that would force a negotiated settlement. The officers who witnessed this truth carried it into post-war life as a burden and a lesson. A burden because they had sent men to die in a war their industrial capacity ensured they would lose. A lesson because they had learned, at terrible cost, that industrial capacity determines modern war outcomes more surely than courage, tactics, or strategy. And that lesson, purchased with thousands of lives in the waters around Leyte, remains the Battle of Leyte Gulf's enduring legacy. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.